Welcome back to the Hack the Midlands studio. My name is James and I'm here to announce our first talk. So I'm delighted to welcome Chris Miller. Chris is a developer at Jump24 and specializes in backend development with PHP and Laravel. Today he'll be talking about his journey from hacker to professional, and we'll be hosting a live Q&A afterwards for anyone that has questions. So I'll stop rambling now and over to Chris.
Hi, so my development story starts all the way back in 1985. One day my dad came home from work. He had a cardboard box, a soldering iron and a book. We sat down at the kitchen table and I remember his exact words to me were, "One day these things are going to replace my life and my job, so we may as well build one." We sat down, we started building this box of electronic components. The extent of help I was giving at the age of 3 or 4 was, "Can you pass me that big bit over there, that little bit over there?" He soldered it together, and eventually we had this working little box. We then went over to a television and we plugged it in. We turned it on, and as soon as it turned on, things started appearing on the screen. It came up with a logo that I'd seen on the news a couple of times called Sinclair. It was a ZX Spectrum 48K, and that was my first computer. Thinking back on it now, the excitement of seeing things appear on the screen and seeing things on screen was quite unique. It was something I'd never seen before. But that wasn't the end of the story with that particular computer. See, the book he'd bought was a book that taught you about the basic programming language. Basic was exactly what it says, a really basic, simple language that explains to a computer things that you want it to do. Over time, we started to write things into the computer, and what I was writing started making things change on screen. Eventually, we had text appearing on screen. We had it taking an input from me on the keyboard, and back then it'd take me 5 minutes to find the A key and 5 minutes to find the N key. But this was quite an exciting thing. It was fun to see text that I was writing make things happen on this computer. But then my dad got out a tape player, and yes, that was a thing back in the 80s, tape players for software. We plugged it into the Spectrum, and we sat there whilst multiple colours flew up and down the sides of the screen, and we sat there and we waited some more whilst it was making this really weird noise in the background. I thought it was funny just listening to this noise, and I thought that's all it was about. The noise was making the colours. Then all of a sudden up popped something new, and it was a game. It was a game called Oracle's Cave. This was a game that was a text-based adventure game, so you'd enter things like turn left, exit east, exit west. But this was in 8 colours. The only thing I'd ever seen from a computer to this point was black and white. Seeing 8 colours back in the 80s was groundbreaking. It was incredible. It was totally unbelievable what we were seeing on screen. That was the first introduction to computing, and I found that set a pathway for my life. All through school, I became known as the one that was interested in computers, with several different insulting nicknames around that. I mean, geek wasn't a thing back then, but you'd got varying different nicknames that would just be used as insults. Throughout school, subjects that interested me were things like mathematics, science, but particularly IT. All through school, information technology was a subject that I found great interest in. By the start of second school, we'd started to see the introduction of what were called personal computers, early generations of Windows computers. And these were, again, quite an interesting subject, and again, it changed how we interacted with computers. It introduced this concept of a mouse. So now not only did you interact with text, but you could interact with graphics on a screen. That was the point at which I decided this is what I wanted to go into. So GCSE, unfortunately, IT wasn't offered as a subject. But what was offered was a computer science and side project. It wasn't a GCSE, but it was run by the IT department as an extra bit of learning that people could do if they wanted to. I took part in that. We got to the end of the first year of GCSEs and around came Careers Day. And at this Careers Day, we had this computer program that we had to enter all of our details into and enter all of the things that we were interested in. And it had put out at the other end things that you might want to do as a career. On the time that I got to that computer, the computer was actually broken and not working. So having played around with the computers for quite a bit of time, I actually fixed that computer, got the program back up and running, and then went through the program. And out of the other end came recommendations of careers, none of which were anything to do with computers, which I thought were quite interesting. But then I spoke to the teachers afterwards and said, well, this isn't the sort of thing that I'd expect this to be saying with my interests. And I was told that computers would be a waste of time and that I shouldn't look at this. It's a good job I totally ignored the teacher. I went on from there, went and did a BTEC National Diploma in Computer Studies. But in between school and the college, I took an internship with NatWest Bank with their IT department, was helping to roll out what was the newest technology then, Windows NT, to the servers, and I think it was Windows XP, it may have been 98, was being rolled out to the desktop machines. I was involved in this. Initially, the placement I'd taken was in the insurances department as data entry, but I raised a question around password security because of the way they were handing passwords around within the bank. Turns out that the policy was perfectly fine, but the IT department picked up on this and they asked to transfer me over to their department for the rest of the internship. So I was helping to roll out to software and hardware upgrades across most of the banks. This again was very foundational in setting a path for me. From there, went into the BTEC National, and I found that although we were covering varying different subjects within computer science, the largest area that I found the most interesting was the development side of things, so writing code. At the time, it was Pascal, Delphi, and Visual Basic that we were being taught. Pascal was probably the most interesting of the three to me because this was almost back to what I'd done before, which was writing text to make things happen. I came out of there with a distinction in the BTEC National, having gone through the whole course, and an outstanding remark for the development section. Having left the college, I went on to set up my own company. At the time, it was primarily focused on networking, basically around laying cables for networks. At the time, cables were the only way of doing networking. Wireless networking wasn't really taking off by that point. But I also did at the time what could have been considered web development. And back then it was pretty much just down to making text look pretty. Images were restricted by the speed of the internet at the time. It was also restricted by the number of people that just didn't have access to the internet. But this was quite a fun time. Had contracts with some fairly large companies and some fairly large councils. But then came a point where I became ill through an illness called fibromyalgia. That illness took me out of work for quite a considerable time. even before that, I was beginning to think about winding up the business because the industry was moving on and I wasn't keeping up, and I just didn't have access to transport of my own. So it was primarily just not as profitable as it once was. So came the time that I wound up the company completely, stopped trading altogether. And I found myself out of work for quite an extended time whilst I was getting used to dealing with fibromyalgia and getting used to dealing with the extreme pain and extreme fatigue that it brings with it. But there then came a point that I started looking to get back into a working life. And I started looking around and applying for basically anything and everything. What I really wanted to do was get back into IT and get back into enjoying working with computers. And it didn't really bother me what particular field within IT this would be. But development seemed like an interesting option. So I was starting to look for development jobs, and it was talking about things I'd never heard of. Things like Python, things like talking about languages such as JavaScript and Node. And at that point, I started to realize that my skills were so far out of date that I stood basically no chance of getting back into this industry. In the meantime, I took jobs working in care, working in multiple different businesses and multiple different fields. But then from there, one day I saw an advert on Facebook for this thing called School of Code. The advert was talking about a 16-week boot camp, 9 to 5, free for people to join, and jobs would be available for you afterwards in development. The way I looked at it, if it's free to join and it's free to do, what's the worst that can happen? Turns out not to give me a job at the end of it, but I get 16 weeks enjoying what I'm doing. So I applied to go onto the boot camp. Went through the application process, and there were hundreds of applicants for this first boot camp of School of Code. Came to the end of the boot camp and initially wasn't offered a place. But then the organizer said to me afterwards, "Leave this with me, I'm going to see what I can do." He came back to me a couple of hours later and told me that a place had been offered to me and that it was being funded by another business. So I took up the place on the boot camp, and I can honestly say that was the best decision I ever made in life. Went on to this boot camp, and it wasn't just teaching me development. It wasn't just teaching me how to write JavaScript. It was teaching me everything I needed to know about how to be a developer. So it was looking at problem-solving skills. It was looking at the soft skills that you need as a developer. It was looking at how to present yourself for talks. It was looking at project management, project planning. And yes, of course, JavaScript was taught in the process, but it was taught almost as a secondary issue. The JavaScript wasn't the main thing of the course for me. That was just learning some syntax. The main part of the course for me was teaching me the process of how to develop and how to break down a problem, how to think about structuring code, varying different elements that piece together to make this course literally life-changing. Finished the course in 2018. 2017. It was the end of 2017. About 3 weeks after finishing the course, I'd found my first position as a developer, and this was working for a company in Wolverhampton as a PHP developer. That company was an interesting place to work, and there was some good points, there was some bad points. After 9 months, I realized that basically I didn't really fit into that company's dynamic. I didn't seem to feel like part of the team. So I left that company and moved on to Jump 24, where I'm currently based now. Jump 24 took a role as a developer working back end with PHP, and have been taught more with Jump 24 than I could ever have imagined. Teaching me concepts of object-oriented programming, test-driven development, why standards are important, teaching me teaching me the key values of collaborating with others, that no person is left to fight a problem on their own, that everybody mucks in together to solve issues that come in. That brings us up to today, where these days I'm found often speaking at conferences, I'm found speaking at PHP meetups, JavaScript meetups, and on the 11th of November, I'm actually swapping jobs from Jump 24. I'm going to be moving back to School of Code, which got me back into the industry as a coach for software engineering. It gives me the opportunity to firstly give back to the School of Code what they gave to me. Secondly, to day in, day out, do what I enjoy doing, which is talking to people, helping people to learn about software engineering. And it gives me the chance to help people into an industry that, for me, genuinely changed my life and gave me the opportunity that I don't think would ever have been possible in any other way. And I know that was relatively short, but the main aim of this was to open this up for any questions that anybody has about ways into software engineering or anything about my own life. There's literally no question that I'm going to hold off on answering on this if I'm legally able to answer it.
That was great. Thanks, Chris. Excellent to hear more about your path to becoming a developer. Many words of wisdom and some great advice for anyone starting a career. So now we'll move into our Q&A section. So I think we have some questions queued up, but if anyone on Twitch or whatever, if you have a question, drop it in the chat. So from Bawahi, do you have any specific goals for your career over the next few years?
So for me, what I'd like to do is to move more into training others into the industry. I'd like to continue developing alongside that, and so I'll be doing private clients alongside teaching. But for me, it's more about teaching others, because this industry is something that everybody seems to think is the hardest industry to be in and the hardest industry to get into, and it's not. It really isn't. I mean, we all joke about it in memes and all the rest of it, but genuinely, about a third of my life is having Google and Stack Overflow open.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. There's kind of lots of winding paths into tech, but the bar isn't necessarily too high for getting in there.
No.
Any other questions? From Wes7979. Hi, Chris. I'm 42 years old. Do you think this is too late to get into the tech industry?
Absolutely not. I'm 40 now. Can somebody do the maths? I was 36, 37, thereabouts at the time that I got back into the industry. There's never a time that's too early. So kids can be learning it in school, kids can be learning it for fun, and there's never a time that's too late to get into the industry. What you do bring as somebody with more life experience is exactly that. You bring life experience and understanding of what the world's like and how people will actually interact with things. As developers, we can often sit in our sort of sheltered little corners of, I know everybody's going to use this button to do exactly what we intend, except that's not what users will do. And the more life experience you have, the more experience you can bring to developing and thinking about problem solving.
Awesome. Any more? Cool. From Register Shift. Did you find the bootcamp challenging? Was it particularly high intensity?
It was challenging in ways that I didn't expect. For me, the challenges were more around the soft skills. Although I'd done speaking beforehand in different circles, the idea of speaking in front of people in the tech industry was like, nope, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. Except that was actually something that turned out to be something I absolutely love doing. For me, now talking to people in tech it's more fun almost than the development itself. Was it high intensity? It's 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So the same intensity as you'd expect from a working day. The key difference with School of Code is that it's a free boot camp based in Birmingham, which have now gone national. And it's free because at the other end of it, companies pay for effectively the training that School of Code have given to the students cohort, as we release them into the industry and help them to find jobs. Every person's experience is going to be different. Some people will find the development side very high challenge, very high intensity. Others will find the soft skills more difficult. Some will find the project management side difficult. And that's why we cover so many things on the course. It pieces together so many different sections of the industry that every person that wants to get into tech can find something they find interesting and can find work in.
Awesome. School of Code is schoolofcode.co.uk for anyone interested in having a look at that. Next question from John Freer. I know how to code, but nothing about electronics. What's the best way to start?
So I'm going to assume the question there is about how to get into electronics alongside code. One of the things that these days is available very freely, very easily is Raspberry Pis are absolutely brilliant for physical hardware hacking, as is the Arduino, any of the variations on that. Electronics is a totally separate field to code. You will find some developers who can do electronics. You will find some electricians, or whatever the term you want to use for people into electronics, can code, but it's not necessarily an area that directly overlap. But yeah, Arduinos are pretty good for getting people to find the crossover point. And if that's an area that you find interesting and looking at, there's thousands upon thousands of tutorials for Arduinos online. The language is very, very strongly based on C, so it's quite a nice, easy language to pick up.
Awesome, thank you. So from Tom, what is your favorite thing that you've created?
Oh, that is a good question. I'm going to go back actually to the thing that I created as part of the final project for School of Code. This one I can talk about more freely than one that I'd love to be able to answer with. That was, we worked on a mind map based CV system. So at the time, social media was still quite sort of gaining popularity. Still, people were starting to use social media more and more at the time, and this is only 4 or 5 years ago. So for me, building that was fun because we got to look at how can we handle storing videos. We got to look at how can we handle graphics in a 2D format using JavaScript. How could we have graphics automatically adapt to the data that's given? So we had to consider building graphics from a JSON output from MongoDB. It was an interesting project, and it wasn't just me on the project, which made it all the more interesting to build. We had a team of 4 of us, and each one of us brought a different skill to the table.
Awesome. Okay, I think that's our last question. It's been excellent to have you, Chris. So next talk, for anyone interested, is at 1 p.m. Jessica is going to talk about imposter syndrome and individual competence. So thank you for tuning in.